What if someone in authority asked you to give someone else a 300-volt electric shock? Would you do it? Would you do it if you knew that this was a dangerous, possibly fatal shock? Would you give it to a stranger? Do you think a friend of yours might shock this stranger? Do you think a neighbor of yours would shock this stranger? And what would you think of the kind of person who would do this? Would you think of this person as cruel or sadistic? What if this person did it to a puppy? What would you think of them then? Really sadistic? Well, Stanley Milgram, in 1963, did an experiment that showed that this kind of behavior may be more common than you think. I'm Dr. Keon West of the Institute of Psychological Sciences at the University of Leeds, and I'm going to talk to you about the Milgram experiment of 1963 on obedience to authority. Milgram started these experiments in July of 1961, and this was a very interesting time. It was 3 months after the trial of the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly. And there were tough questions about morality and obedience in Europe. Following the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust, many people were asking, what was wrong with the Germans? Were they special? Were they evil in some way? Stanley Milgram wondered a different question. Is it possible to do things that go strongly against your own sense of morality if you're commanded to do it by a figure in authority? To investigate that, he needed a certain setup. This setup included a shock generator. In the picture, it probably looks like a cheesy 1960s prop from a sci-fi show, but it looked to them like a shock generator. It had switches on it that could say how much shock you were giving to someone else. It also had a label on it with a gradiated scale that started from 15 volts and then went up in 15-volt increments all the way up to 450 volts. At the 300-volt mark, there was warning and danger, but there were labels all the way along, saying slight shock, moderate shock, danger, severe shock, extreme shock, letting people know that you could actually do someone damage with this shock generator. To test it, Stanley Milgram also needed participants. To do that, he recruited 40 people, all male, between 20 and 50 years old. And the last thing he then needed to set up this experiment was a confederate. And I'll explain to you what the confederate did in a moment. All the participants were paid $4 and 50 US cents, which in 1961 was an awful lot of money. But they were told that they were paid simply for coming. This is a very important part of the experiment because no one can then say that they thought they would lose the money if they didn't do it. It wasn't about the money. They were told that the money would be theirs to keep no matter what they did afterwards. And then they were told that they had a job to do. They were told that they had to instruct the confederate and to teach him word pairs. A word pair is a very simple idea. I say dog, you say cat. I say puss, you say boots. Something very simple like that. But these pairs of words were very long and very difficult. And it was very hard for the confederate to remember, or at least that's what the confederate pretended. And then they were given one more instruction. If the confederate got one of these word pairs wrong, so if I say dog and then they say boot, you're supposed to give them a shock. And every time they get one wrong, they're supposed to get a higher shock. So they go up in intensity every time they get one of them wrong. At this point, I should explain to you, just so you understand that Stanley Milgram himself wasn't an evil and amoral person, that the shock generator was fake. No one was actually getting any shocks. But the confederate was trained to play the part. He was an actor. And this was very convincing. To set it up, the confederate had to come in and be strapped in with electrodes to this fake shock generating machine. They pretended that the confederate and the experimenter were strangers, that the participant was the only person who was unaware of this relationship. More than that, the confederate was given very specific instructions. So the confederate was supposed to complain. The confederate was supposed to writhe around, supposed to jump, was supposed to shout every time that they got shocked. As they got closer to the 300 point, the confederate was supposed to complain of a pain in his heart and the fact that he couldn't keep going, that he had health problems. After 300, the confederate was instructed to go completely silent. And if they kept shocking, the confederate would no longer complain. They'd no longer make any noise about the experiment. And as far as the participant was concerned, they'd assumed that the confederate was dead. So now that you know what the setup looks like, and I'll show you a quick picture of what it looks like just so you understand. Again, it's a bit of a blurry 1963 picture, but you can see them strapping in the confederate. You can see that he looks like a regular guy off the street for 1963, and and that he's ready to get these shocks. So if you understand this very convincing setup, where you have the student, who is a Confederate, the teacher, who is a participant, and the experimenter, Stanley Milgram himself, giving them orders, the question then comes up. How many participants would follow through with the instructions to the end? Now, I'm sure you're wondering, how were they encouraged to follow through? Surely participants didn't want to. Well, Stanley Milgram had no power. He couldn't do anything to them. They were strangers. They got the money for free. As soon as they came in, they got the money. They didn't have to give it back if they didn't comply with the instruction. And they were explicitly told that nothing would happen to them if they walked away. If they refused, he had 4 tactics up his sleeve. They were simply 4 sentences. They refused the first time, he said, please continue. They refused another time, he'd say, the experiment requires that you continue. If they refused a 3rd time, he'd say, it's absolutely essential that you continue. And if they refused a 4th time, he would say, you have no other choice, you must go on. That is the entirety of the arsenal that Stanley Milgram had at his disposal to convince these people to shock another person. How many of them do you think shocked him once? How many of them do you think shocked him up to 30 volts, to 45? What percentage do you think went up to 300 volts? What percentage do you think went up to 450 volts? Before you answer that question, I'll tell you that Stanley Milgram polled other people at Yale University, which is where he was at the time. And he asked them, what percentage of people do you think, if I get normal people off the street to do this? The estimates were incredibly low. They assumed that between 0 and 3%, at the most, 0 to 3, would take it all the way up to 300, where it said danger, shock. What's your estimate? And I'll give you a second to think about it. Write down the number if you want to be absolutely sure that you guessed. How many people do you think of this 40? What percentage do you think would shock people up to 300? The answer might then surprise you. All of them, 100% of them, continued up to the 300 volt level. And 26 of the 40, that's 65%, most of the participants continued all the way through to the end, even past the point where the Confederate went silent and made no more noise. And as far as they knew, the person was dead. And this changes the nature of the question. Would you give someone a 300 volt shock? You probably assume no. You probably assume your friends wouldn't, your neighbors wouldn't. You probably, like the other people at Yale, assumed very few people at all would do it. But Stanley Milgram's experiment showed that in the situation, most, if not all of us, would shock people to an incredible degree, just because someone told us to do it, even though this person had no power over us at all. Now, this doesn't mean that the participants weren't distressed by this. The participants didn't want to shock the other person, and they many times in the experiment said that they wanted to leave, they wanted to quit, or they didn't want to do it at all. I'll read you a short excerpt of something that one of the observers, he also had observers looking at the participants from behind a one-way mirror, what they wrote about the participants while they saw them do it. I observe a mature and initially poised businessman enter the laboratory, smiling and confident. Within 20 minutes, he is reduced to a stuttering, stammering wreck. At one point he muttered, "Oh God, let's stop it." And yet, he obeyed to the end. Now you might be thinking, this is a very strange experiment and maybe a strange situation. Maybe it only worked that one time. If you watch the other podcast on why we use laboratory experiments in psychology, you'll see where I explain the importance of replication, so that we know that the finding isn't a fluke, but a genuine finding. Stanley Milgram repeated his experiment 19 times, and other psychologists since then repeated the experiments as well. And all of them found similar results. Most or all people were willing to shock another person way past what you think would be normal or safe, just because a figure in authority was commanding them to do it. In one particularly chilling example of a replication of Stanley Milgram's study, Sheridan and King thought that perhaps participants were continuing to shock the Confederate because they knew it was a Confederate. And even if they didn't know, maybe they suspected that the pain wasn't real, so it was okay if they carried on with the game and kept shocking the Confederate. To show that this wasn't the case, in 1972, Sheridan and King used a real victim. They actually attached real electrodes to someone, but it wasn't a person, it was a puppy. And this puppy received real electric shocks for doing things. In this experiment as well, most of the participants carried on shocking the puppy. 20 of the 26 participants shocked the puppy to the end. Although they admitted to feeling a lot of distress, just as in the original experiment, they were willing to actually shock a puppy because they were commanded to, by someone with authority, but no power. The shocking implication, if you'll pardon the pun, of Milgram's experiment is that most people would do things that strongly conflict with their own morality if this action is commanded by an authority. It's worth pointing out that if you have the knowledge, you've already won a certain portion of the battle. This means that when someone asks you, would you shock someone toward the dangerous level if you were commanded to by an authority, and you say no, now you can ask yourself much more seriously, and you can put yourself in the shoes of one of the participants in Stanley Milgram's experiments. You can recognize and predict your own behavior because you know more what your behavior is likely to be. And you can be a bit less harsh on other people who've done bizarre or atrocious things because they were responding to authority. There is no easy way around this. There's no simple way of avoiding the influence of authority on our lives. But if we can recognize it when it's coming, then we can do more about it. And we can, in those situations, do what we really think is the morally appropriate thing to do. And with that, I'm Dr. Keon West of the Institute of Psychological Sciences at the University of Leeds. That was the Milgram 1963 experiment on obedience to authority. Thanks.